Greetings, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor. Today's question: Dear Pastor, I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and not a single LCMS church practices closed communion in Phoenix, believe it or not. In fact, believe it or not, the LCMS pastor in the town that I grew up in Iowa, who's a very solid confessional LCMS pastor, told me I should join the WELS and tolerate their error because it was better than LCMS. He basically said that it was a lesser of two evils situation, where I had to basically pick the church that was closer to the Lutheran confessions, and unfortunately in Phoenix, Arizona, where the LCMS is quite liberal, the LCMS is closer to the truth. As I'm sure you are aware, the primary difference between LCMS and WELS is the doctrine of fellowship. LCMS teaches levels of fellowship, while WELS teaches the unit concept. I was wondering what the Aldona position is. Does the Aldona hold to the unit concept, i.e. prayer is not allowed with other Christians, or the levels of fellowship position, that is, only the altar and pulpit is to be guarded, but prayer is fine with heterodox churches? All right, well, right out of the chute, I got to say, I have no problem whatsoever believing you that there's not a single LCMS pastor in your area that practices closed communion. Open communion and selective fellowship, that's the norm in the Missouri Synod, even though its official position is closed communion. I'm also not surprised by the counsel given to you by your former Missouri Synod pastor. He counseled you to go and worship at a congregation that he believes to be in error. His answer is also then an admission that the church body to which he willfully belongs is itself riddled with error. And his answer to the problem of false doctrine in both fellowships is essentially, well, pick a local congregation that's closest to the scripture and disregard the doctrine of church fellowship in its entirety. Disregard what's going on in the other churches of that fellowship. That's exactly, though, what he's doing by remaining in the LCMS, in spite of the fact that his synod has, for decades, renounced the Lutheran confessions by their official statements and resolutions. The pastor's answer is essentially, well, pick the least amount of error. And if you were choosing a restaurant at which to eat, then that'd be fine advice. Pick the restaurant with the least health code violations. But you're not dealing with a restaurant. You're dealing with a church. And the amount of error is really irrelevant. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, after all, as Paul tells the Galatians in Galatians 5, verse 9. And for that reason, both the LCMS and the WELS should be marked and avoided. Now, to the question, though, about church fellowship. Both the WELS and the LCMS's doctrine of church fellowship are wrong. The WELS defines church fellowship as, quote, every joint expression, manifestation, and demonstration of the common faith in which Christians, on the basis of their confession, find themselves to be united with one another. What this means is that every expression of faith to the WELS is equal. Their theses on church fellowship states that this includes pulpit fellowship, altar fellowship, prayer fellowship, fellowship in worship, fellowship in church work, in missions, in Christian education, and in Christian charity. Yet insofar as they are joint expressions of faith, they are essentially one and the same thing, and are all properly covered by a common designation, namely church fellowship. What the WELS is saying here is that anything a Christian does to express his or her faith, anything that manifests that faith, or demonstrates that faith, is part of church fellowship when done with other people. So this means that a prayer before a meal with your Presbyterian grandmother, that's a joint expression of the faith, and so it's church fellowship, and you must mark and avoid praying with your grandmother. Church fellowship for the WELS runs through individuals, not through the church. Now, on the other side of the coin, the LCMS practice of altar and pulpit fellowship, it's an attempt to run church fellowship through the marks of the church, that is, the gospel rightly taught and the sacraments rightly administered. This means that congregations and church bodies only share communion in the sacred things with those with whom they are in communion with the apostles' doctrine, meaning whom they have doctrinal agreement. Lutherans confess in the Formula of Concord. We believe, teach, and confess also that no church should condemn another because it has less or more external ceremonies not commanded by God than the other. If otherwise there is agreement among them in doctrine and all its articles, as also the right use of the holy sacraments. That's in the Epitome, Article 10, Paragraph 7. So if there is an agreement in the doctrine of the gospel in all its articles, and the sacraments are used according to Christ's institution, then church fellowship can be recognized. That means they can have communion in the sacred things. They can have those in common. The office of the ministry, then, and the Lord's Supper, the preaching of the gospel and the sacrament, those things then can and ought to be shared. The LCMS excluded prayer from this because prayer isn't a means of grace, a mark of the church whereby God gives us Christ's benefits. So prayer isn't the same thing as the word and sacraments, nor is it in the same category as the word and sacraments. Now, the problem with the Missouri Synod doctrine of fellowship, though, is that many pastors, and let's be honest, elected officials in that church body define altar and pulpit fellowship so very narrowly that they make levels of church fellowship, or they entirely ignore it altogether. But a narrow definition allows LCMS pastors to participate with pastors of heterodox confessions in joint wedding ceremonies or civic religious ceremonies, such as the 2001 Yankee Stadium event, which, by the way, nearly 20 years later, still hasn't been scripturally rectified. And then all sorts of other unionistic and syncretistic shenanigans. The WELS, by equating prayer with the reception of the word and sacraments, though, is also wrong. So the LCMS falls into the opposite ditch as the WELS by making levels of fellowship other than altar and pulpit fellowship, and by making those levels automatically acceptable. The true doctrine and practice of church fellowship, though, is somewhere in the middle, somewhere in between. Against the WELS, prayer isn't a mark of the church, nor should it be assumed that prayer is of the same nature as the ministry of the word and the sacraments, because prayer is a fruit of faith, but it's also a confession of faith. And as a confession of faith, it has to be in harmony with the marks of the church and under their control. What this means is that any joint prayers must be viewed as confessions of faith. It also means that sometimes the proper confession of faith is to not pray with someone from another denomination. What determines when it's profitable to pray with a Christian of another denomination and when it's not? Well, it's simply the context of the setting and one's vocation. So, for instance, praying with your Presbyterian grandma before a meal at her home means giving thanks to God for his provision along with her. It doesn't mean that you're having church fellowship with her. It's a confession of faith within the family relationship. While prayer is a corporate act of a church, it's also a private act of individual Christians within their families, within their homes, and even within their societies. And those relationships have to be factored into the matrix. On the other hand, a pastor praying with pastors of other confessions, that is, other denominations, that would be inappropriate because the pastor is an official representative of the church. By praying with false teachers and erring Christians, he gives the impression that there is unity of belief with those pastors and their congregations when there's not. Therefore, in that instance, that would be a bad confession of the faith. Ultimately, equating prayer with the use of the marks of the church, which create and sustain faith, it confuses the public and the private nature of prayer, and it ultimately leads to a sectarian attitude. Defining fellowship simply as altar and pulpit fellowship and claiming anything else is fine, that can only lead to bad confessions of the faith, as it does all the time in the Missouri Synod. Christians, though, are members of the church, and they live under the marks of the church, and so their private prayers are governed by the word and by the sacraments. A far better approach than either a restrictive procedure, like the unit concept, or permissive levels of fellowship, is to simply live in one's vocation. Now, this requires that you make a clear confession of faith. And when determining if prayer with another Christian is a good confession or not, it's helpful to acknowledge the difference, first of all, between false teachers, those who stubbornly support false teachings, and those who are simply erring brothers and sisters. Depending on one's vocation, on your social setting, and on the other person or other people, then sometimes praying with them can be a good confession. Sometimes it's not a good confession, and it would only confuse the doctrine of church fellowship more than it already is. May God grant you and all faithful Christians wisdom to know the difference. We'll catch you next time on ATP.